Hey, Anjali, you're live. Do you want to do the intro?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. Welcome. We're so thrilled to have you at the stellar panel talking about tackling the 3C's: colonialism, capitalism, and corporations. I just want to acknowledge, well, first I'll introduce myself. I'm Anjali. I'm a climate activist. I'm a communicator. I'm a supporter of people's movements. I recently founded the Padma Center for Climate Justice, which you'll hear a bit more about later. Before we move forward, I want to acknowledge that I am calling in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I want to acknowledge that when we were here to talk about the 3C's: colonialism, capitalism, and corporations, and we can't talk about these 3C's without acknowledging that the worst intersection of them has been taking place on these lands for hundreds of years, with the systemic genocide and erasure of Indigenous peoples, cultures, ways of knowing, and worldviews. So this ongoing and intensifying conversation that has followed the discovery of the 215 unmarked graves in Kamloops, followed by several similar findings and no doubt hundreds more across these lands, has made this conversation all the more clear. The violence done to Indigenous children and to all Indigenous people is deeply connected to the violence done to ecosystems and to human and non-human communities across these lands. So our work to dismantle the power structures of the 3C's is fundamentally tied to Indigenous liberation. So with that context, I'd love to open up our panel. We also would like to acknowledge the support of the Canada Council for the Arts for our Salon series, including this event. We have amazing speakers here today. So first, I would like to introduce Jennifer Abbott. Jennifer Abbott is co-director of The New Corporation alongside Joel Bakken. She's also the director of another film out now called The Magnitude of All Things. She is a Genie and Sundance award-winning filmmaker dedicated to filmmaking as art, philosophy, and activism. And I will, is Jennifer here? Oh, awesome, great. Hi, yes. Jennifer, I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with you today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'm going to introduce our next panelist, who is Norm. And Norm has been the executive director of the Vancouver Aboriginal Community Policing Centre since 2016, and is a wisdom holder from Titkit community in the Stetnik Nation. I really hope I'm pronouncing that properly, and I apologize, Norm, I didn't go over that with you. Norm shares about the Indigenous worldview and ways of being and knowing and communicating, and also shares about Indigenous relations, including genders, the written word, and with the land. So welcome, Norm. I would also like to introduce David Ng, who is a queer feminist media artist and co-founder of Love Intersections. He's been working in association with Cool.World, co-founder Kat Dodds, who's also here behind the scenes right now, and has been working with Cool.World since the original corporation film in 2003. Now he's part of the grassroots team and is taking a leading role in getting this film out to the world. So welcome, David. Excited to ask you. And we also have Kat, who is also part of the grassroots team and has been working tirelessly on getting this film into the hands of activists, land defenders, and people who need to see it and have this conversation. So thanks, Kat.
Thank you.
And all right, so thrilled to have everyone in conversation today. And I just want to allow everyone to get a chance to sort of say their piece around the intersection of these 3C's. I mean, there's so much to talk about here, obviously. But I want to hear a little bit about how each of you understand how these 3C's collide. And you each bring a really, really different perspective. And I have specific questions for each of you, but maybe we could just do a little opening, sort of 2 minutes each, on how do you see these 3C's collide in the world around you today? And I kept that very, very broad on purpose. And how do you see them collide in your immediate work, in your immediate community? Who would like to kick us off? Maybe I could ask Jennifer to kick it off.
Sure, I will. First off, I would like to acknowledge I'm on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I'm very grateful to live and work here as a settler. I mean, I think this is such an important conversation to have, and I'm really, excited that there seems to be a greater willingness in the culture to have this conversation. As a filmmaker, what I've tried to do for my whole career is actually make the familiar strange. And so take social constructions that most people assume is just the way things are, that's mostly unquestioned, and to question them and to shine light on their social construction. And I think that for me is sort of my central interest in the way these 3C's intersect. And actually, I would love it to be 4C's, which will add climate change, because they're also, just all so interconnected. For me, the stories that we tell about who we are as a species, and various cultures, obviously Western neoliberal culture has come to dominate that, sadly, and with countless destructive ripple effects on so many ways we can just choose our existential crises today. But for me, I think it's really this worldview, which is that we are separate, that there's a hierarchy, that humans are on top, especially white male humans, and that our place in this world is not to live in harmony with the non-human, and but rather to extract what we can. We're individualistic, selfish, motivated by those drives, and I just really feel like that worldview and its rise to dominance, most notably in the last 40 years, but obviously it's been around a very long time, and enabled colonization to begin with. So it's that worldview that I feel is the sort of central, let's say, driving force of these 3C's, and I'll even say the 4C's.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Norm, we had this conversation on a couple of days ago on the Drawing Wisdom podcast as well, and just thinking, Jennifer, of what you're talking about, this extractive entitlement, really colonial entitlement that's so built into our nature. I think that's the really like we can talk about all of the sort of redistributive needs of rights and whatnot, but if we really don't deal with that sort of extractive colonial entitlement, unfortunately, because in Canada we've just discovered, or there's been the discovery of all of these mass graves recently, and unfortunately it took that for this these conversations to be really at the forefront again. But thinking about just even the nation state of Canada, this lie that we've been told about the promised land, if you will, right? When really Canada was designed, the nation state, as purely for extraction of resources to the crown. And so the way I sort of see these linkages too is like, capitalism is really just a mechanism of colonialism, and corporations are a mechanism of capitalism, right? So they're so entangled and they're so embedded into our nature. So we'll launch this conversation on that very, very depressing and it's difficult note, but I think that's sort of what the film really touches on too, is this sort of it's all of this extractive nature of corporations, but it actually is deep down in embedded in our communities.
That was really beautifully summed up. Capitalism is an instrument of colonialism, and corporations are an instrument of capitalism. Norm, would you like to?
And all of them, to us, like for Indigenous people in the Americas, it's easy for us to equate them all or ascribe them to colonization, right? So they're all pieces of colonization from our perspective. Maybe other cultures, because maybe colonization happened so long ago. But for us, it's easy to say, well, these all came with colonization, and so they're part of. And the more we see, the more we learn about them and how effective they were, each little bit, whether it was religion or education or monetary systems or governance models or these things, economic models, they're all part of colonization, and they're all built and designed and very effective at advancing and completing colonization. And probably one of the most effective ones was the systems of written laws. So we see that very effectively, and governments around the world have used it very effectively. Once you have the power and the authority to write the laws, well, you win, right? So if, like I often say, if we played Monopoly and I get to write the rules, I'd win. So then all we have to do is examine who's been writing these rules for all these years, these centuries, these millennia. And it has been old men, really, for their advantage. And that, to me, highlights one of the worst effects of colonization is its treatment of women, and that the normalization of now this world. Is there a country, is there a continent, is there a culture where women are safe? And colonization has ruined that for humans, and corporations play just as much a role as anything else in that. But to us, it all falls under the umbrella of colonization. So we've really shifted from trying to discuss reconciliation. We kind of don't anymore. It needs to be decolonization. And it's not just for our benefit, it's for everyone. Because, if you go back in all of your family histories, you go back far enough, and you have suffered the injustices of colonization as well.
Yeah. So, you all frame this so differently and in such beautiful ways. And one thing I'm seeing is that we're looking at colonization as the umbrella for these intersections of the 3C's to take place. Colonization is this like original sort of drive and push that creates the conditions for capitalism. And capitalism relies on these structures, these corporations, to carry out its purposes. And David, you mentioned the word extraction, and colonization's sort of one of the fundamental sort of purposes of it is extraction, right? It's like you go to different cultures and places and extract the good things and sort of erase everything else. And how do you see that sort of concept of extraction relating to so many of the other problems in our world? I mean, Jennifer, you sort of spoke to it. You said the 4th C, climate change right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I even see it in like the so in the work that I do with Love Intersections, we tell stories of queer people of color, and a lot of even in the in what we've sort of really. What we try to interrogate also is how we are in relationships with communities that we want to work with, and even in our relationships, we can be a bit extractive, right? Like even when we're meeting with someone or in conversation with someone, there's also an innate like what am I getting out of this conversation? That's I mean this is sort of what sort of I think underpins what we're talking about in terms of also colonialism and entitlement and extraction, as well as how are we actually in relationship with people, right? How are we going about in our lives that in ways that are extractive as well? Yeah.
Did either of you, Norm or Jennifer, want to jump in on that extraction piece? I think that's fascinating. I want to come back to that fractal piece as well.
Norm, you. Oh. So I guess for me, there are many ways to describe our economic system, but I predominantly choose 21st century extractive capitalism. And I think that ultimately it's even the word extractive, it's really an ugly word to me and kind of a vampire-ish. But I think if we look at colonization, 500 years in this continent, 200 in Australia around the world, different amounts of time, ultimately we have this situation where there was a commons, and it may not have been clearly defined as such, and no doubt there would have been other words used to describe it, but it was sort of this, the world was not divided up into mine and yours. And I think, if we look at the history of colonization and 21st century extractive capitalism, which is really just this whole momentum accelerated to a degree that is unfathomable. It's really extracting things that were once considered part of the totality, and something that we could all participate in and gain from. That might be water, that might be air, that might be oil. So, for me, extraction out of the commons, that's the history of colonization. Extraction from indigenous people, extraction from other cultures other than Eurocentric cultures. So anyway, I just wanted to add my relationship to this word extraction. I don't know if others perceive it as being an ugly word, but I do.
It is 100%. I mean, the extraction of the resources from the commons, as you said. I mean, from my family history, I'm from South India, and South India was a colony. So was Sri Lanka right below. And I often thought of colonization as this sort of central beast with these metal hoses just sucking things out from wherever they needed it. And so with India, that was, tremendous amounts of wealth, like natural resources, like gold. And but they would also rearrange the entire economy of the colonies to suit that extraction, so that it's designed for extraction. So Sri Lanka, for example, was converted into mass plantations that would optimize extraction of rubber for the colony, for the colonizer. And the same thing happened with textiles and gold in India. And then the people get arranged in formations to optimize extraction. So it's really, the extraction thing goes so deep in so many ways.
So the indigenous worldview doesn't allow that because all those things are not property. They're not stuff. They're relatives, right? So we're in relationship with all those things, including the land. The land is our oldest ancestor, our first ancestor, the one we share with the dinosaurs. So when I do a land acknowledgement, I acknowledge the land itself first, because the land has always provided us everything. And she's like our first grandmother. And having provided everything without question or limit or condition or interruption, that's essentially a definition of love. So we have that relationship of that the land loves us and has given, we've grown up out of the land. And all of your ancestors did at some point too, right? There was a place where your ancestors lived for 1,000 years or more and had the same relationship with those lands and understood it that way. So it's not property. It's responsibility to take care of, to manage, to use, to protect in a good way. So we learn how to take a plank out of a tree without killing it. We learn how to take bark from a tree without killing it, because that's our relative. It's not stuff. And it's an ongoing relationship all the time. And so you cannot treat a relative like property. And unfortunately, the colonized worldview, they became disconnected. And then they were able to turn everything into property: land, trees, children, women, people of other colors. And we kind of didn't do that. But we hope there's a way back.
Would you say that way back, you mentioned the word relationship as foundational to that. So is relationship the opposite of extraction?
I don't know if it's the opposite, but they're incompatible.
Mm.
You know, it doesn't mean like we could catch fish, right? We could, you know, hunt whale, but there was a respect, right? It was a relationship with all those things. Uh, Maybe it's the idea that all things have spirit. So, so if we accept that all things have spirit, everything in the universe, to exist is to have spirit.
Mm.
But then colonization, recently I just realized that colonization created these things that don't have spirit because they don't exist. And a corporation is one of them,
Mm.
right? And kind of the concept of money is another. And I'm wondering what other things then could we say that don't have spirit?
Yeah.
Because us, all things have spirit. So if they have spirit, we're related because we have spirit too.
I would maybe add in there also reciprocity as well, right? So I'm in thinking about relationship, I'm thinking about extraction and sort of what is the antithesis. So thinking about how what Norm's talking about, I think, is also how as human beings we're in relationship with the land and entangled also, right? Where it's not indivisible from that. But also when you're in relationship, if in a good way, you would hope that that relationship is reciprocal too, right? And so we're not just taking and taking and taking from the land and as I mentioned earlier as well, from each other, but we're also thinking about how can we actually be in a relationship in a responsible and reciprocal way.
So this is an interesting tension. You know, I, as a climate change activist, you know, sort of grapple with this a lot, the tension between the individual and the collective, and how my individual choices are sort of like in harmony or in alignment with the collective. And someone from the Facebook chat also just talked about colonial individualism versus the collective. And so I like want to dig into this concept a bit and ask a little bit if you can all speak to your tensions between the way you choose to live as an individual within a deeply sort of colonial and capitalist system around you, and how that plays out in your life, in your choices, in your work, in your community. It's a big question, a broad question again, but I'll throw to Jennifer.
Yeah, this is I think it's a really interesting area of conversation. And again, one that I really see a foundational shift in the last, say, 5 years, because there was a great article in The Guardian probably about 5 years ago. And the headline was, you know, neoliberalism has conned us into thinking we can fight climate change as individuals, you know?
Yes, I know what you're talking about.
You know, and it was like, yes, that's absolutely true, and it's an absolute con, you know, to and to think we can that our power lies as consumers, and also that we can fight the system, it's just behemoth on our own, and ultimately I really see in the zeitgeist are, you know, more and more people are understanding our power lies as citizens when we work together in solidarity and create bridges where maybe there weren't before. So, you know, for myself, like I've been, you know, I don't want to go on too long, but, you know, I used to be obsessed with shopping for a better world, and I'd make lists. And I remember once I sent my boyfriend off to the grocery store with lists, you know, buy this, don't buy this. And he came back with everything on the list of don't buy, and he had got the columns mixed up. But, you know, I just like, so much energy in my life, and I've lived on a permaculture farm. I've driven an EV for 5 years. I'm, you know, mostly vegan, blah, the whole thing, you know, for many decades. But ultimately, you know, what I really have come to believe is that hasn't meant anything in terms of impact, and what has made a difference. And you know what I'm probably most proud of in my life is that our first film, The Corporation, was credited as one of the top 10 films to inspire the Occupy movement, right? And so it's like, that is system change, you know, and that maybe has an impact. I just one thing though, what I do think has the impact though of my attempt to be a conscious person that lives with integrity, and I fail sometimes, I succeed sometimes, but I think just the attempt and the authentic desire to live in this world in creating as the least amount of harm as possible, I think what that's impacted more is myself and my own sort of feelings about myself and how I am in the world. So, and I'm not suggesting to people, because it has so little impact in the big picture, don't do these things, but rather let's know where our true power lies. Let's put our energy there. You know, let's try and have integrity in our daily lives, and know that attempt buoys ourselves, buoys our spirits. And when our spirits are buoyed, those around us are buoyed. So that's, anyway, I love this this area of conversation. Thank you.
That's a beautiful way to bring it all together as a non-binary. I love that. Norm, you look like you wanted to jump in there too.
Sure. So you say neoliberalism conned us. I say colonization conned us. And there's hundreds of amazingly brilliant cons that colonization has played on all of us. So we don't believe that we're separated. We are always connected to everything all the time. And that's how we exist in the universe. Like the other universe, the colonized worldview, is that everyone's an individual. And essentially everyone's alone in the universe. And to us, that's terrifying. That does not make sense. And that's not a universe any of us want to live in. That's not a universe that's worth living in. So we know that we are connected to everything, everywhere, all the time. And it's not bound by time or space, because spirit isn't. And one of the other major cons has been that you only have 5 senses, right? Like, absurd. Everyone knows that. You have a sense of time and direction and justice. So there's more, and it's that interconnected sense is something that they've been trying to teach you that doesn't exist. And yet each of you probably realize that, you know, you can be a Zoom room and feel a sense of connection with the people in the room, or in an audience, or at a distance even. And it's possible. And you can't prove it because science hasn't caught up yet to what Indigenous people have known for thousands of years. So this individualism, this idea that we're separated, I think has led to what the number one growing mental health challenge in cities is loneliness. And it doesn't have to be. So we've learned through our work with trauma, and the greatest source of trauma is colonization in our mind. And so, and the best treatment or approach to healing that is reconnection with everything and everyone, because the more alone or lonely you feel, the more disconnected you are. And we're supposed to be connected all the time. And then that feeling of aloneness or loneliness just doesn't have a chance.
David, I want to give you a chance to before.
Yeah, I'm kind of going to. I'm just also reflecting on Jennifer's comments, because I'm kind of going down memory lane of when I saw the first film as well. I actually think I saw like the 5-hour rough cut on VHS. But you know, when I watched it when I was 15, it galvanized my entire high school. Like we started a sustainability club. I remember this, and I remember all of this. It was sort of these conversations. Gosh, I guess almost like 20 years ago, around sweatshops and stuff. And it's amazing to see how, like, I'm just reflecting on actually the fact that we're talking about the 3C's. I could never have imagined that. You know, it's actually, it's amazing. But in terms of thinking about, I'm just thinking about the question around individual versus collective. I'm just reflecting on some of the learnings of organizing that I've had over the past few years. You know, I have a degree in social justice, so I'm obsessed with organizing for social change. But one of the things, the biggest learnings that I've had was around when we've put all of the focus into the organizing and not the relationship work, the organizing falls apart, because there's no foundation of trust that happens. And so you can you can know all of the social justice language and talk about power and inequality and social change, but unless you sort of also spend time, in my opinion, it should be even more time thinking about those relationship pieces and how you're in relationship with the people that you're organizing. The organizing can often fall apart too. And so I'm thinking, I guess in a way, it's decolonizing our way of organizing, and thinking about, and thinking about how we fall into those traps of individualism, even as we're fighting for social justice and social change.
So true. Yes, the colonized mind, right? Like it's that individualism seeps into all of us, and I know that I fight it a lot. And you know, this is so interesting to me because there's this notion of good, of universal good, and it's something that, you know, some people say, many cultures and many traditions say that that's something that we are connected to as humans. Like we have a sense of what is good, what is right, and what is resonant of truth and beauty. And this sort of colonial capitalist model sort of rips us away from that and makes us question morality itself. So I wonder if you could like speak to that. I mean, Norm as well, like how do we reconnect to what we know is good? Because we know that corporations, right? I mean, that was the whole thesis of the first film, Jennifer, where, you know, they were like, they're being treated as humans, but they're not humans. They're actually being sort of structures devoid of morality, and they sort of act on this blueprint of endless growth. So how do we reclaim a sense of knowing what is right and good collectively and on an individual basis as well? That's also a good question.
Yeah. Well, I think it comes back to, well, we're limited by the language, right? So the language of English is a colonized language, and it has its limits. And so I always ended up at this place where there's love and then there's not love. And so what was the difference between those things that are loving and those things that are not loving? You know, I think we all agree that love, and most, you know, religious traditions always ended up that love was the answer and we're supposed to act from love. But the definition of it was always elusive. But it came down to whatever tends to connect and join and unite us more is love. And those things that divide and separate and isolate us are not love. And so the more connected and joined and united we are and collective we are, then I think that that's the goal, because that's how we exist in this universe. That's how we're going to. And again, most religious traditions came up with the same basically set of rules, that we're supposed to take care of each other in a good way, as just as we expect other people to take care of us, and do it with love. And so to me, it's as simple as that, but
simple but profound. Does anyone else want to jump in on? It was a very broad, you know, thing around corporations and morality and what we know is good.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that comes to mind, I don't know if it's one thing that's just popping up in my mind is also the ways that colonialism and capitalism has imposed on us a sense of progress. What does progress look like, right? And I think, Anjali, this is what you're touching on, and what the film touches on is like colonialism, or the corporations are branding themselves as progress, right? And things happen in this sort of linear temporal trajectory, right? And we know that it's destructive. And I think that's sort of what's really powerful about the film, is that the destructive nature of corporations in manipulating what is progress, what is human progress. And of course, that's tied to the you know, colonialism, those colonial entitlements and entanglements that we discussed at the beginning as well.
Yeah, I'm loving what both of you are saying, and I think you know, what you said, Norm, is just so profound, and it's sort of like a guiding principle, it feels like to me. But again, I'll come back to story and the role of story in, you know, constructing our worldviews. And so, of course, with our films, we really try to show actually manipulation is one of the criteria of our psychopath checklist. And you know, I think that obviously corporations and colonizing ideologies are extraordinarily good at not only manipulation but also gaslighting. You know, I think the good news I witness is people aren't buying it as much now. I'm gonna have to test. There's a cushion to that, and there's obviously this huge segment of the population right now very vulnerable to conspiracy theories, and we have all, you know, Fox News and Russian bots and all kinds of others that are sadly miring so many people in just such falsehoods and creating such division. So I'll acknowledge that, but at the same time, I see within a different segment of the population this sort of explosion, really, like, you know, I almost see like this explode, you know, some corporation will spew some line about some greenwash, and I just see like people not buying it, as they shouldn't, because we have no reason to believe them. You know, we're you know, we're on the precipice, we're on the cliff, related to climate change and other existential crises, and the inequalities that we're seeing, and the lines that corporate ideology and colonizing ideologies have been spewing related to trickle down, or related to, you know, whatever it may be, and that definitely started you know, really gaining momentum with Reagan in the 80s. But I'm just, you know, and how so many people bought it is just beyond me. Like, I just don't know how people bought these. It's just like such fantasy. But what I really am seeing is this discernment now, and there's just very little time for it. And so if we look at climate change, it's not just climate denial anymore, it's also climate mitigation denial. You know, unfortunately, many of the corporations, like in fossil fuel corporations, they've really learned how to use the language of sustainability, but they're not, you know, enacting real policy that's going to actually change things. But I'm seeing people see through it. So that's my so in terms of that, does segue to our other conversation, you know, related to I guess I would say, how does one live with meaning and integrity in this world? And so, like, for me, people have to have knowledge. And people, I do really believe, for the most part, I've changed. I used to think that humanity was fundamentally good. I don't know if I can say that anymore, but I do think a large proportion of humanity is fundamentally good and want to do the right thing, but they have to have knowledge to do the right thing and be exposed to worldviews that are different than colonial and capitalist worldviews, which just reduce us to the most terrible of traits. Yes, we have those traits in us, but we also have other traits, and those are the ones we need to nurture and bring forth.
Yes, I think that's beautiful. David, did you want to jump in there?
Well, I was just reflecting as Jennifer was talking too, you know, like all of the social upheaval and galvanizing of social movements that have happened during quarantine. And I know the film also touches this as well, you know. And I'm also reflecting on like this, you know, in 2020 when quarantine was imposed and everyone was scrambling to be productive, you know. And that's capitalism, right? And all of a sudden now I'm finding in 2021, we've somehow, you know, capitalism and colonial have somehow very, very, very quickly, again, extracting our labor very, very, very quickly. And at the same time, I look at all of this, like, you know, within months of the pandemic, the conversations, like fringe conversations that, you know, in progressive movements have been fighting for a while, all of a sudden we're in the forefront. Like I'm thinking about living wage, for example. That was, curb in Canada. That was like almost immediate, right? How come that it took a pandemic for us to think, oh, actually, you know, people need, there's a base minimum that people need to survive, let alone, let's not even get into the conversation around people on disabilities, not even getting that amount, right? But I'm thinking about like safe supply and harm reduction, those conversations in Vancouver where I live, all of a sudden right in the forefront. The Black Lives Matter movement too, unfortunately, due to the death of George Floyd. But we're actually having conversations and doing in some places, unfortunately not in Vancouver, but defund the police is actually a conversation that's on the table, And so I think about, as much as, and I know we'll probably get into this later too, but as much as quarantine has separated us, I'm thinking about also what has been possible in terms of organizing against, as Jennifer mentioned and as Norm also mentioned, this type of greenwashing that has happened. I would say from corporations, but also like the nation state as well, right? There is a reckoning or questioning of these institutions that we take, that we assume are looking out for us, right? Yeah.
Well, there's an interesting tension there that there's so many pieces to this, but one of the big conversations that happened in the pandemic, and I do want to touch on the big reckoning that followed Black Lives Matter, which the film does address as well. But another big conversation that happened was this conversation around inequality, right? Because that's one of the defining features of neoliberal capitalism. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to make it a key tipping point conversation. And I think the pandemic brought us a lot closer. And, we saw inequality just spiral in the pandemic. And we saw billionaires actually amassed 1.4 trillion, I believe is the number, which is like unimaginable number, more during the pandemic by profiting off of it. And I think that's a conversation that's starting. Jennifer, you're talking about like people waking up to these things. And, it's interesting that we're also seeing at the same time this like age of misinformation and people being very skeptical of not only corporations, but also government and sort of any authority figure in media. And the film really, sorry, I'm taking several steps here, but bear with me. The film really names this tension between corporations and government and how corporations have worked to undermine the role of government, and how government has actually been undermined quite successfully by corporations. And so I wonder how that's connected to this sort of wave of people who are distrusting of all institutions, and also how that's connected to this rising conversation around inequality and where we take that energy, where do we put that energy? Jennifer, you probably have, you have so much expertise.
I have a lot to say about all those things. I don't want to take up too much time. Well, one thing, okay, so if we look at inequality, I think what's really interesting and is for me in relation to the pandemic. I mean, obviously the pandemic laid bare the injustices of the system. And again, people are, as in the horrific discovery of the 215 children in Kamloops graves, it seemed to me that those sorts of instances, while so tragic and terrible, at least I'm quite heartened that they actually seem to be convinced. Like, it's like, what is it going to take to convince people? And it seems to me there's been certain moments, like George Floyd, that convinced a lot of people that systemic racism exists. The Kamloops discovery convinced a lot of people that Canada is founded in genocide, right? And I think so. The inequality that was shown in the pandemic, like what that has really, I think, brought that issue to so many people's consciousness. And what I'm really finding interesting now is, employers are having a difficult time finding workers to do jobs that nobody wants to do, because what they've done is they've lost their indentured servants, right? our system relies on the existence of poverty and the existence of the threat of poverty. And that forces people to do things that they don't and wouldn't otherwise do. And so if they're getting CERB checks or some equivalent in whatever countries they may live in, and they don't have to take those jobs anymore, then to me that's just, that's liberation from indentured servitude, and it's a reason to celebrate. And let's hope that challenge, like, we don't, it just takes will. We have, our public policy is so focused on the employer as opposed to the employee. If there's a threat to inflation, then all of a sudden we enact public policy to address it immediately. Well, we could just as easily enact public policy to address systemic poverty, right? And it's just all a matter of our priorities. So I guess that's one issue that's come up that I find really interesting related to inequality. Sorry, I had one more thing to say, then I'm going to throw it over to someone else. But what was sorry, I've lost. Your question also touched on.
Well,
what was
the question was, where do we put all this energy, where we have corporations letting us down, people are starting to seed through that, and governments letting us down.
Right. Okay, this I'll just very briefly say and pass it on. Was I've looked really closely at the history of the acceptance of the demonization of government, and we explore both in both of the corporation films, and obviously it's to corporations' advantage for us to think of government and as something that we want minimally, and to look to corporations as saviors, and the corporation put our faith in corporations to do the right thing. That all we're doing in that case is relinquishing power to corporations. But really government is the only institution we have, and I would include international governing bodies as well, because I think those are going to become more and more important in this world. Government is the only place that we can aspire for democracy. That's not to say that government, there's horrible governments, there's corrupt governments, and all the Canadian government is enacting horrible policy in some instances without question. But this is the only institution where we can aspire to democracy, and it's always aspirational. And if we lose that, then we've really lost a lot. So I just think it's, and I'm quite hardened because Biden, I'm no big fan of Biden, but he questioned trickle down. He questioned, and he's trying to pass all this legislation that is much more New Deal than Reaganomics. So I think things are really shifting, and that I think the pandemic has also shown people that there's a role for government in a time of crisis.
Interesting. Redefined one. I'm curious. I want to ask Norm about this, because government, like the state, as we're seeing now in this conversation, that people are waking up to this fact, is government is a colonial institution, right? And it's founded upon this bedrock of genocide, and is also deeply capitalist in and of itself. But also government is a structure that we can mold and shape and create. But how do we reconcile? What I find personally, I haven't engaged in a lot of electoral politics. I prefer movement building, because I find that it's easy to find so many colonial attitudes within electoral politics. So how do we redefine this role of government while also bringing in these anti-colonial values, these indigenous values? How do you square the two?
Well, I think all of you, and me too, have to get deeper into how colonized are you, because when Jennifer says our systems, that doesn't include me, because they're not our systems. They never were. None of these systems were ours. Not our language, not our governance models, not our laws, not our way, not our understanding of relationship with the universe. And so those systems that have been imposed on us, and we've felt this for hundreds of years. It's just the pandemic that made you all feel it too, right? So it became a little bit more widespread, and so more people said, "Oh, this is not good." It's like, well, it's never been good for Indigenous peoples. So we knew that those children were there. Like my nation went over in 2017 and did ceremony and brought those spirits home because we knew that they were there. We didn't have to disturb the ground, but we took care of it in a good way, in our way. So you have to get out of the box. You got to get out of the colonized house. And we actually do some training to take you to the windows and say, there's this whole thing out there. And we do it in 8 sessions, and we take you to 8 windows and show you there's more. And that's where we find our healing and strength and our power and all those things that enabled us to survive the colonization that was imposed on us, our ancestors, and they did. And we retained that. So we don't only inherit the intergenerational trauma, but the intergenerational power and strength and resilience and spirit to survive. And so we can use that, to overcome these things, which this isn't our first pandemic, right? It's not even our 10th pandemic. So we know where our spirit and our strength and our power and the depths of those lies, and it's in the land and the ancestors. And I think some of us are willing to share that with everyone, because I think that you had that too. If you go back far enough in your ancestral family history, it's there too. I don't know how humans came up out of Earth without it. So we just simply have to reawaken that, and again, see through the cons of colonization, because there's many.
The cons of colonization.
Well, it's making me think about, hearing both of you, also how colonialism and capitalism produces scarcity as well. I'm just reflecting on, I'm a part of the Vancouver Artist Labor Union Cooperative, and we founded actually at the beginning of the pandemic. A terrible time to start an organization, but one of our core values, and we're a values first type of organization, is that scarcity doesn't exist. It's something that was produced by capitalism and colonialism. Like I think about while everyone was while the government was debating curb, they somehow found, what was it, like billions of dollars to bail out Air Canada, right? And Air Canada also paid out 10 million of that to their executives. So I think just going back to where there's a will, where there is a will, and the government definitely has a will to bail out large corporations. There's a way, and so rethinking sort of our prioritizing of thinking about collectively what are we prioritizing, what needs to change, and how do we advocate for that. Norm, go ahead.
So I want to make a point. So this broadcast is one of an instance of using the tools against itself, right? So this is a tool of technology and even corporatism and the internet and promotion against itself. So I've been really looking at how we can use the other tools, effective tools of colonization against itself. So whether it is engaging with memes or even bots, or even finding a way to turn corporations against colonization as well. And maybe one that hopefully I can get off the ground this year is the concept of church, because that was used so effectively against us. But if we can flip it and use it as a tool against colonization, then we think that might be very effective for some of the things that we also want to do as well. So if you put your minds to those, then I think we can find some help.
Oh, it's beautiful. I want to hear more about that. I have so many more questions for you, but before we go further, I want to invite back in Kat Dodds, part of the grassroots team, one of the impact producers for the film. Welcome back, Kat.
Hi, I remembered to unmute myself. Hi, I was in the background because I didn't want to take over the conversation with all these amazing people talking about us together. But I wanted to just come in now and reflect on a few things and talk a little bit about what we hope to do with the 1,000 screenings for the new corporation campaign. But before I even talk about that per se, I just wanted to reflect a little bit on some of the interesting themes that came out of this conversation just now, because it was very exciting to see the threads between this concept of the collective versus the individual, or the in particular the colonized individual. How that's so contradictory in terms of what we want to do in terms of organizing and social change. And I think that thinking back to the first film and remembering the very different world it was at that time in some ways, in good and bad. Good in the sense that we had this moment, I think, where we had an unbelievable theatrical experience that I don't think will ever happen again, even if there wasn't a pandemic. But we've had a complete opposite, and here we are in our electronic theatrical universe. But there are possibilities in that. And so, like the very last thing Norm said, using these tools against them, like if we actually are able to use what we've got to use to connect people and to connect movements and to connect organizers, and actually not have to do the physical act of getting to different countries, we have no limit to who we can connect with in this particular way. But it does require sort of being more intentional and focused on making those connections and figuring out what to do with them, and taking conversations like this and turning it into something that has momentum. I think that's really my biggest hope for all of this is. And this event right now, it's a bill of Cool.World, which is the company that I co-founded with several partners, and I'll talk about them a bit later. And the new corporation is kind of the coming full circle, because we did some interesting things with the first film, and we kind of built our own technology at the time, because remember, way back then there was no social media. So that's how long ago that was. I think blogs had just become a thing, barely. Like, that was the context we launched the first film in. So now we have a world where things are in so many ways so much worse. So there's a lot more at stake in using these tools to do that connecting. And that's our vision with the 1,000 screenings. So I don't know if the people watching this webinar have all had a chance to see the new corporation or not. To point out, you still have time. It's going to be available through our screening platform until midnight Pacific Vancouver time tomorrow. So you've got time after this if you want to go and watch it and you haven't yet. If you have watched it, either through our new platform or elsewhere, we would love you to also think about how you could get involved in this, because the 1,000 screenings campaign is really, imagine if we had 10,000 screenings hosted by change makers, educators, and organizers, 1,000 dialogue sessions to talk about climate, racial and economic justice, connecting the dots between colonialism, capitalism, and corporations, like we have been in this conversation. And also imagine what digital organizing and digital democracy would look like if we, the people, had our say. So I think, in speaking to what Norm was saying about government and the very, very flawed nature of its origins, even here, certainly here in Canada, I think what we have to do is engage in rising up and sort of let's start talking about harm reduction when it comes to government. That's my thought about that. I don't think we can get rid of government, and I also think we have a responsibility to make these institutions better. But I think at this point, we're really talking about reducing the harm that they're complicit with, because until this relationship between corporations' control of governments over, in particular, the lobbying around the extraction industry, that's a very good case in point, we have to actually rise up. And I think the way we can do that is if we can get 1 million engaged people all ready to take action through our screening series. So that would be really the vision of what we want to have happen with this. And I'll throw this over in a minute back to Anjali. But in the film, Grand Chief Stuart Phillip makes the connection about these colonial, destructive corporate agendas being completely out of control, which I think is we've all been witnessing, but also linking it to this is a global thing. Like as Norm was saying too, Indigenous people everywhere are facing these issues, but also all of us who are not Indigenous to this country, our ancestors were Indigenous to somewhere, and we have all kind of lost something in the movements and migrations and genocide too. Like I think that's one of the things that I've been coming to terms with in light of the news that's happened, because I've known about these stories because I've known Indigenous people who've told me these stories. So I'm looking at the shock of some Canadians who are just discovering that, you know, our country is based on genocide. And I have to feel like we have to, at some degree, realize that those of us who are not Indigenous, and especially those of us like me who are white, have to look at the intergenerational supremacy that we've inherited. And really think about it in that, because there's so much talk about intergenerational trauma right now. But I also think that we have to look at that entitlement that's at the root of extraction, which has come out of this conversation so beautifully. Pointing out that Anjali is in the film. If you've seen the film, you'll have noticed she's in there. And she talks about the connecting of the dots that we've been discussing right now. And what we're looking for are community hosts to use the film. And Padma Center for Climate Justice is one such community host. So I'll invite Anjali to talk a little bit about what Padma is going to be up to, if she doesn't mind. I'm turning the tables and asking the host the question now.
Thanks so much. This film, the original corporation film, was a really big turning point for me, and it actually influenced the direction that I chose to go in my. I was in high school, I believe, at the time, and it influenced the direction that I went in university, and so thank you for that. And then so this film, I was just so honored to be a part of it. So the Padma Center for Climate Justice is a new movement building hub, essentially, and the goal is to activate especially diaspora communities right now, because we need so much solidarity. We need a deeper notion, a reclamation of solidarity. We need solidarity with Indigenous peoples. We need solidarity with the global South and people's movements in the South, where the demands for climate justice are being felt in a real lived way. The demands for climate justice are originating from movements in the South that are largely Indigenous-led, actually. And so the center will sort of activate people from diaspora communities and beyond as well, and talk about this intersection of the climate crisis and globalization, where globalization's at. And Jennifer, you have a whole career spanning and witnessing the arc of sort of globalization movements. And so we want to dig into that, to connect the older generation of globalization activists, anti-globalization activists, to a younger upcoming generation, and really embed these intersections in a more intersectional movement for climate justice. So I think showing this film is a powerful tool. It's a real tool to give us language for that, and to give us a way to articulate these things and give us a focus point to do our work in. So yeah, looking forward to hosting some screenings, and we hope that whoever's watching will consider doing the same with any institution in your life, really, any organization. Or institutions are, from an organizing perspective, a really powerful place to begin, a really powerful place to do the work from. And there's so much power that each of us holds just based on the networks that we belong to, the institutions that we have in our lives. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that would be my sort of call out and challenge to anybody out there watching or that will watch this later broadcast. If you're an organization that you think that this would be of value, there's quite a few ways you could help us. And I think we're going to want to take some questions if there are questions from the people listening. But David, can I just go back to the slides and I want to finish off? So this is the screening page, which if you've been to it, you will know that you could watch the film. What this actually marks for us as Cool.World, the company behind this platform, is the beginning, the first unveiling of what we now have, which is a combination of the DRM server, which just means protected streaming of the film, with this ticketing platform. And what's exciting about this is we're going to be able to offer this kind of page to any organization so that they can actually host their event, describe their event, a panel perhaps like this, or whatever else they want to do alongside the screening. They can have their calls to action. They can even raise money for an initiative or for their organization through it, because now we put the ticketing together. And the way that I'd like to describe it is like, imagine if Eventbrite had a mission. And imagine if this was a collective one that wasn't just about one project, one thing where Eventbrite gets to benefit. And this is at the heart of what we're up to with Cool.World, is building collaborative tools that help do the work we want to do and potentially even support the work through revenue as well when we need that to keep it all moving. And the ways that you could help us is donate to us on Patreon, give us a one-off donation, fund our collaboration with Padma Center for Climate Justice, and of course, most importantly, to host a screening or series of screenings yourself if you're an organization. And we also are wanting to get people to help us co-create curriculum for schools, which happened organically during the first film, and we'd love to really encourage that again, because this film is going to have its best life in the world if it's used just like we're using it now for dialogue. And if we can get into the hands of more people that way, it would be awesome. So you can take away the slide deck now. And I want to hand over the facilitation reins back to Anjali for now. I think you wanted to ask the panelists questions, and also if we have any questions from our virtual audience out there that we can't see, but we'll,
Yeah, I would like to invite whoever's watching to submit questions. We'd love to hear. We'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to pass on a couple of your questions to the panelists. We just have a few minutes left. Probably just time for a couple more questions.
No, we've got a half an hour left because we're going till 1:30.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah, because we knew what happened last time. We didn't have enough time for the questions. Yeah.
The last screening that I was a part of, the 1 hour was definitely not enough to really dig into the juicy questions. So, I think we've covered a lot of ground with the personal and like the fractal nature of the sort of way of being in the world, moving towards a better world, from the personal to the collective, to the global. And I have one more question about where we're at right now for Jennifer, and then I want to move into what's next and where do we take this energy and where do we move next. But I want to ask a question that sort of spans the distance between the two films. And around 2003, when the first film came out, that was sort of the heyday of anti-globalization of the movement. And for those of you who remember in 1999, the Battle of Seattle, where it was people power that really shut down the WTO talks and had a strong say about the global inequity that was happening. Where have we come in the 18 years since then? And I'd love to start with Jennifer and throw to everyone else as well, but where has neoliberalism taken us? Where do we find ourselves in this moment? What are the key, what are the sort of standout pieces of it that we need to fight back against the most? we've touched on individualism and those things, but yeah, just want to.
Yeah. Well, I think in many ways, they are the reasons that we felt we needed to make a sequel, and why we called it the unfortunately necessary sequel. Is I'm Joel Bakken, the co-director and writer. He has a different relationship to wanting to make the sequel than I do, and his really is that we failed the first film, and it's not as if we had such hubris that we thought we could change everything with one film, but ultimately all of the issues that we were challenging, be they inequality or the outsized power of corporations, or climate catastrophe, or et cetera, all of these things in the last 20 years have just gotten exponentially worse. So I think in terms of the globalization movement, 9/11 happening really did derail things, and I often reflect and wonder if that hadn't happened, and the trajectory that we seem to be on in terms of challenging corporate power back then hadn't been derailed to the extent that it was. I often wonder, would things have turned out differently? But for me, I think right now, how I define this moment in time is, we are without question standing on the edge of a precipice. Very few understand just how vertiginous that fate is, and that we really are about to go off, and that we have really, if you choose your existential crisis, whether it's the outsized power of big tech, profound inequality, climate catastrophe, systemic racism, you can choose any of those, and if we don't make progress on all of them, then we're really heading into some even bleaker times than we're already in. And I feel like people are starting to really wake up to that. And that's the sort of, like, for me, hope hope can be a form of denial in and of itself. I explored this a lot in my other film, The Magnitude of All Things. But the authentically hopeful part of this story is it really does feel that this questioning, this deep, profound questioning of everything we've been told, and even a feeling of betrayal, like, how could we have landed here? I think people are really waking up, and people are really willing to take risks and make sacrifices that they weren't before. Now, obviously, when I say people, I don't mean everyone. I mean some people. So, but I do think that sort of defines this moment for me. Extraordinarily precarious, and at the same time full of possibility.
Wow, what a way to frame it. Extraordinarily precarious, yet full of possibility. I agree with you. We've never quite felt an energy like this in the air, and I think it's collectively felt, right?
Yeah, I think so.
How do you feel, either Norm or David?
Well, one thing that comes to mind, and I kind of mentioned this already, but I'm just thinking around, we're in Canada where I'm situated. There's a lot of protests and conversations around decolonization, and specifically the toppling of statues. And while they're great symbols, I'm suspicious, if you will, of the will to actually enact real, decolonial changes, and I think I mentioned this example already at the offset, but I think about, like, the BC government. It was such a landmark decision for the BC government to adopt the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. But in that declaration there's clauses around land, and yet they've authorized at the same time, the logging. I'm just thinking about the situation in Fairy Creek, and so we have all of these broad gestures or arguably distractions of so-called reconciliation, or these claims for doing reconciliation or whatnot, but the actual structural changes, we're not seeing those manifest in the same fervency or whatever as these these toppling of these statues. So I think yeah, I think there's still work to be done, and I think this these conversations that we're having around like these colonial entitlements, right? That we know that the structural pieces are and systemic issues of capitalism are the problem, and we know we sort of can think about what needs to be undone, but what about those sort of embodied and innate colonial ways that we've been colonized? I'm just thinking about what Norm also mentioned earlier, right? How do we actually undo those things that are deep down inside? Because I think that's likely, if I may hypothesize, that's probably a large part of why we haven't seen a lot of those changes since the first film. Is a lot of these deeply entrenched colonial attitudes and ways of being that we haven't figured out how to undo yet.
So to me, ultimately, it comes down to a battle for public opinion. If we can influence and shift public opinion in this way, but ultimately it also becomes one at a time. And because of the pandemic and moving to Zoom and moving into decolonizing work, we've sort of stumbled onto an approach and some methods that are able to provide a safe space for people to, as Jennifer says, re-examine those fundamental principles and values that our lives, our careers, our livelihoods are based on, in a way that doesn't push people into becoming defensive and fall into shame and guilt and those things, but then to say, then how then do we shift to a different way of behaving and relating to the history and to where we want to go, and learn to be good human beings from a safe space together rather than separated, because it's easier to do things together than alone. So we have to reconnect people and then teach them the tools on how to maintain the connections and then how to act from that place together. And we stumbled on some things that seem to work even across Zoom, and it's the technology helps, but I don't credit the technology. I credit the human ability to connect through spirit, which I think all our ancestors understood. And so as we tap more into those again, we can become who we're supposed to be rather than where we ended up,
And I guess, well, before I ask you sort of the more inspirational sort of final question, I do want to throw to some of the questions from our viewers. Someone asked, how do we move beyond symbolic representations of decolonization, such as statues being toppled, to create real change? Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, there's simple ways. You can like and follow the hashtags of decolonize, and all those people who are using those hashtags, like them, multiply them, repost them, donate to them. That helps, and it amplifies, magnifies. And then at some point, if you decide that some of these things are things that you stand for or that stand for you, then stand. Get up off the couch, stand up, and go somewhere and do something. Stand with, stand beside, don't stand in front of or behind, stand beside.
Yeah, and if I may add, like I think the connection between, the statues being toppled, the genocide, the mass graves, the genocide is directly connected to the land back movement. They're not separate. And so organizing for structural change and not just the representations of colonialism to be toppled involves exactly what Norm's describing, is supporting indigenous struggles and land back. Those are just inextricably connected, and of course connected to the role of corporations that are also enforcing that type of extractive and colonial subjugation.
And next question here is, if we are interested in the curriculum development as an activist artist, who do we contact?
Well, I guess as the grassroots team, you can contact me. But if you go to our website, there's a form that you can get in touch with us, and me and some of our other grassroots team receive them, and we're happy to connect. We also take volunteers as well. As Kat mentioned, like we want people to host screenings that are on issues that matter to to people's communities. And so yeah, there's lots of ways that you can connect with the grassroots movement.
Yeah, and I would say that where you can find all of that at would be at the newcorporation.movie on the grassroots page. Maybe we could put that link up again. To follow the take action part in the menu. So there's ways you can get in touch with us that way. You can also get in touch with us through Cool.World, where you registered, and you could give us some comments either in the feedback form that you'll get a link to in an email or even at the end of this. So that has room for comments. And if you're really eager to get involved, then send that to us. You don't have to fill out all of the questions. You could just skip to the end and tell us what you would like to help with. That would be awesome. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for tying it to land back, David. I think that was a really great tie-in, and also one of the questions that we had in the chat. And I think it's it's a beautiful tie-in to what Norm was saying. The power of doing things together, which is in another way of saying the power of organizing, the power of collective action. So, there's one more question. Okay. Your thoughts on connecting decolonization in Canada to others around the world, Palestine and the Americas. So I guess other parts of Turtle Island.
Yeah, makes total sense, right? Because everyone, whether personally or in your family history, has suffered injustices of colonization, right? And if not the injustices, the traumas, right? People forget that those who are even benefiting from the colonization, who committed or implemented the colonization, that was traumatic for them too. So they inherited those traumas too. They also inherited more benefits than us, but there's traumas that's inherited as well. So yes, I think we need to form these alliances and understand the common interests that we have, and those injustices that seems to be largely committed by the 1% and doesn't benefit the 99%.
Yeah,
I'd say the largest group is women.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that too. Obviously, I'm wearing my keffiyeh, my statement at the moment. But the whole issue of equating this land back movement, it's happening in the demonstrations. Now people are making that connection. They're making the connection between Black Lives Matter. I've seen that in demonstrations too, and what's going on in Palestine. And this is another example of what the small percentage of powerful people with a lot of money that would like to push us into saying that when we criticize the nation state, or when we criticize a nation state, we're being racist. Like that's the sort of Hasbara commentary out of Israel. So we're dealing with this in Canada right now. This debate is happening here about whether or not we actually have the freedom to say these things are the same thing that we are actually critiquing when it comes to the foundational genocide of the making of Canada. And these things are very clearly, like the word settler colonialism is part of what that narrative is all about. And it's certainly not only here, and it's certainly not only in Palestine. It's really this narrative that's everywhere. I don't have as much knowledge around the Americas, but maybe another panelist could speak to some of that. But the truth is that it's always about land. It's always about control of land. It's always about extraction. And as much as we like to distance ourselves from it, it's always about genocide, because that's how you forcibly remove people so that you have access to what they have or what you consider a resource. So this is a real challenge we have, I think, as progressive activist people, is to make sure that we don't let the criticisms be silenced, because our own governments are supposed to listen to us. So we need to tell them. I think right now in Canada, what needs to be told to the government is that we need to rewrite the TRC and take out the word cultural and leave it as genocide. And because right now that document, which has been around for a long time, so there's really no excuse for Canadians not to know about these things, but it's been turned into something that doesn't have to be acted upon because it's not as serious as genocide. If the word was genocide, it would actually be actionable. And that's one of the things that I think is part of the reckoning we have to make with these things, is that we can't, I don't think it started with any one of these things, but I think it became amplified with George Floyd, that moment when people could not ignore systemic racism, like was brought up before. But I sort of see many, many things, including the murder of the Muslim family in London, Ontario, only a week ago. These are all part of the same structural power systems of colonial capitalism, extractive, corporate.
Yeah, if I may just quickly highlight, race was, I think there's a reckoning of that, race was created by colonialism, right? Colonialism needs systemic racism, as Kat described, to say that, Black and Indigenous people aren't outside of humanity, really, and therefore can be subjugated, right? And so we're seeing these pop up again and again. And as Kat mentioned, in places like Palestine and in other areas, that creation of racial hierarchy is embedded in that settler colonial, and also, by extension, also corporate enforcement of capitalism.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I'd just like to add, if I can, I absolutely agree wholeheartedly, but I do think it's also important to note that it's been about land, but it's also been about labor. And, colonial capitalism is also built on slavery and continues to be built on indentured labor. And that may be in the future increasingly irrelevant with AI, but if it isn't about extracting surplus value from marginalized and disenfranchised folks, it's going to be about controlling them and surveilling them to accept a profoundly unequal and destructive society. So I just think it's really important to keep the labor conversation going as well.
Absolutely, and that's a really critical piece of the movements that we need. The movements need to be different this time around. I mean, it's not like movements in the past were wrong, but we are evolving, and our movements now need to become even more diverse and more worker-centered, to be honest. They need to be focused on these intersections where people are actually redefining and enriching what we think of as solidarity. So that we have international solidarity, we have worker solidarity, we have solidarity with Indigenous peoples, and across all classes and sectors. So, that's a big, bold, and beautiful vision to end on. We're in our final minute here, and this conversation could have gone on for hours, and I would love to do that. Reclaim that tradition of just like sort of teach-ins and long conversations that really dive in to these important themes. So I hope we get to do that one day. I just want to sort of take everyone out with maybe just a very short reflection, maybe one or two words, and it could be, we talked about balance, and we talked about, Jennifer, you talked about the hope, the possibility, and the tension of this moment. So I just want to invite all of the panelists to name the balance of things that they're sitting with right now in this moment. For me, I'm sitting with a mixture of fear and tremendous excitement for the things that could come. And what are you all sitting with? You can leave the audience with that.
I think I'm the same. There's some fear, but also some excitement as well. I'm just thinking about some of the possibilities that we've also identified and discussed in this conversation, and it's exciting. So thank you.
Yeah, I feel very energized. I'm so honored to have participated in this conversation with all of you. And so I feel energy from that, and I'm very grateful for what I learned and what you shared. And yeah, I guess right now it changes. Obviously, sometimes I do feel a great deal of fear, not right in this moment. It's more energized and excited.
Great.
I'm reminded, and I'm not exactly sure if it's true, but someone told a very dear friend that the symbol for chaos, the Chinese symbol for chaos, is the same as the one for opportunity. So in some ways, that's the opportunity that we have. But I also don't like hope, and I don't like trust. I much prefer faith. And because faith is deeper, and faith is not easily shaken, whereas hope and trust, it often leads to disappointment or betrayal. But faith, I think, is, and I have faith in the land and in the people. So, and that's, I don't expect to see it shaken.
It's beautiful. Thank you. And Kat?
Mm-hmm. I think that what I feel right now is some of that excitement too, and expectation too. I think that I think there's something emerging out there in the zeitgeist, and I hope that we can tap into it and be part of it, and that whatever happens with this 1,000 screenings is somewhat transformational as a process and as a the conversations that could happen and the calls to action that could come out of it too.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your deep wisdom and for your honesty and for the tremendous inspiration. All of these conversations enrich the movement with each conversation that we have. So thank you for that. I'm very blessed to be in conversation with you all. And thank you so much to the Cool.World team as well for bringing this together.
Okay. And I'm just going to list off some of the credits that we have for this episode. So we would like to acknowledge again the support of the Canada Council for the Arts for this salon series and this event. And thank, of course, our guests and their organizations, the Padma Center for Climate Justice, the team behind the new corporation, VAC-PC for the incredible work they do and contributing their time and effort today. And of course, personally, to Norm, Jennifer, Anjali, and David. And we want to point out that there's one more TNC related event today in case someone wants to catch it. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives has a conference on corporate mapping going on, and directors Jennifer and Joel will both be on that panel at 4 p.m. Pacific Coast time. So that can be found also on the New Corporation website if you're looking for how to find that. And we'd like to thank our team behind the scenes. Webinar series producer Melissa James, technical production today by Cameron Lee, Sandy Haxey, and our Cool.World CTO and partner David Griffith, who have built the screening platform we just launched today. And promoting this event today has been our team, including Jane Tattersall, digital strategist with Squeeze, managing our digital ad campaign, and with our organic efforts being amplified by the Sierra Club BC, along with our team. Special thanks also to Daniel Northway Frank, who helped us write the Canada Council grant that got us here. And I must, of course, also acknowledge our Cool.World platform partners, Jen Evans, who will be hosting the webinar on Tech Reset Canada at the end of this month, and Lena Menifee, who is hosting the next webinar. And now we can show that webinar graphic. So our next webinar is on June 24th, and it's Disrupting Data and Distribution for Indigenous Audiences and Allies. And it will be co-presented with Stories First and hosted by Lena Menifee, featuring Jade Begay from Indigenous Rising in the US, Mary Lou Mintram from Rainy Storm Productions here in Canada, and Delphine Levens from Gower Street Analytics in the UK, discussing how audiences are consuming Indigenous content and why measuring it is needed to put power and knowledge back in the hands of Indigenous creators. You can register at cool.world/webinars. So thank you very much. For more information about upcoming screenings and how to become involved with our campaigns, go to cool.world/join us, and we will be sending out a feedback form shortly. So please let us know what you thought of today's event. And if you want to get in touch for further information and or events, please do. Thank you very much.